An old man stood on his porch, the sun beating down on him like a hammer. His name was Henry Whitmore, and this land was his entire world. For 37 years, he'd poured his blood, his sweat, and his soul into this patch of Arizona dirt. But now, it was all about to be ripped away. The drought had seen to that. 14 months without a drop of rain had turned his green pastures into a cracked, dusty moonscape. His cattle were walking skeletons, and his heart was just as barren. He pulled a crumpled letter from his pocket. The words were burned into his memory. Vincent Garrett, the banker, a vulture in a suit. Final notice. Payment due in full. $8,000. He might as well have asked for the moon. Henry had $200 to his name. By sunset tomorrow, the ranch, the house his wife Martha had loved, the barn where his son used to play, it would all belong to the bank. It would all be gone. He and Martha had built this place from nothing, fought off raids, survived killer winters, and buried their first child on the hill behind the house. This was supposed to be a legacy for their son, Nathan. But Nathan was gone. 15 years. 15 years since that terrible night. The shouting, the bitter words, the slamming door. "I hate this place. I hate you," Nathan had screamed, his face twisted with teenage rage. Henry had called him ungrateful, a fool, and his son had ridden off into a thunderstorm, leaving behind a note that said he was never coming back. Martha never gave up hope. She kept his room just as he'd left it. She set a place for him at dinner every single night. She died 2 winters ago, her last breath a whisper of their son's name, her eyes still scanning the empty horizon. Henry flinched as the sound of hoofbeats pulled him from the nightmare of his memory. 3 riders. His stomach turned to ice. He recognized the man in the lead. Vincent Garrett, a day early. The devil always arrives ahead of schedule. Garrett was a snake, tall and thin, with eyes as cold as a grave. The 2 brutes with him were his muscle. Men who got paid to break things, mostly bones and spirits. "Well, Henry," Garrett called out, his voice smooth and sharp like broken glass. "Still here, I see. I trust you have my money." Henry walked down the steps, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. He was old, but he wasn't dead yet. "The notice said tomorrow, Garrett." Garrett laughed, a dry rattling sound. "I thought I'd give you a chance to avoid a public spectacle, a quiet transaction between gentlemen." "I've got $200, Henry said, his voice flat. Garrett's eyes danced with amusement. 200? My dear man, that wouldn't even cover the interest. Dutch, he said to one of his goons, a mountain of a man with a scarred face. Why don't we just take his remaining cattle? Because, Dutch, Garrett sighed, I'm not interested in walking skeletons. I want the land. The railroad is coming through next year. This dirt will be worth a fortune. His smile was predatory. Nothing personal, Henry. It's just progress. My wife is buried on that hill, Henry growled, his hand tightening on his gun. You'll take this ranch over my dead body. That, Dutch sneered, his own hand moving toward his pistol, can be arranged. But before the air could explode into violence, another voice cut through the tension, a voice that seemed to come from the heat shimmer itself. Gentlemen, seems like a heavy conversation for such a hot afternoon. Everyone turned. A lone rider approached from the west, moving with an easy confidence that set every nerve in Henry's body on edge. The man sat tall on a magnificent chestnut mare. He wore a long, dusty coat, and 2 colts were tied down low on his hips. This was no drifter. This was a man who lived and breathed violence. His face was hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but you could feel his eyes on you, weighing you, judging you. This is a private matter, stranger, Garrett snapped, his own confidence wavering slightly. Keep riding. The stranger pulled his horse to a stop. He looked up, and for a split second, Henry saw his eyes, piercing blue, and they were familiar. Where had he seen those eyes before? Private matters involving threats against old men tend to become my business, the stranger said, his voice a low rasp. Dutch bristled. You watch your mouth. Easy, Dutch, Garrett warned, studying the newcomer. He was trying to size him up, but it was like trying to size up a rattlesnake. You knew it was dangerous. You just didn't know when it would strike. I am Vincent Garrett, president of the Tombstone Bank. Garrett, the stranger acknowledged with a nod. Heard the name. Can't say I've heard anything good. Garrett's face turned a shade of purple. And you are? Someone who believes in paying his debts. The stranger's gaze shifted to Henry. I understand you're in a bit of a bind, old-timer. How much is it? Henry swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. $8,000, due tomorrow. 8,000, the stranger repeated. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold. He tossed it to Henry. The old man fumbled it, the weight of it nearly pulling him to his knees. He opened it and gasped. It was filled with gold coins. More money than he'd ever seen in his life. I can't even count this, Henry stammered. $8,750, the stranger said calmly. Should cover the principal, interest, and whatever creative fees Mr. Garrett here has tacked on. Garrett's face was a storm of fury and confusion. Now see here, this is highly irregular. You can't just, can't I? The stranger's voice turned to steel. I thought money was money, Mr. Garrett. Or does your bank not accept legal tender? Of course we'll accept it, Garrett hissed. But I demand to know who you are. For all I know, this is stolen. The stranger's hand moved. It wasn't a blur. It was faster than that. One moment his hand was empty. The next his Colt was leveled directly at Garrett's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. I'd be real careful about the words you choose next, the stranger said, his voice deadly quiet. Some words have a way of getting a man killed. The air was thick enough to choke on. Garrett's men looked at each other, their bravado gone. Garrett slowly raised his hands. No accusations, he said, his voice shaking. The bank will accept the payment. The stranger holstered his weapon as smoothly as he'd drawn it. I'm glad we understand each other. Now the paperwork. I assume you have it. Garrett, with trembling hands, pulled a folded document from his coat. The deed. Henry took it, his heart pounding. He turned to the man who had just saved his life, his home, his world. Sir, I can't accept this. This is charity. It's not charity, the stranger interrupted. Call it an investment in keeping a piece of the real West alive. He looked past Henry, his gaze lingering on the small cemetery on the hill. On Martha's grave, the look on his face was one of profound, personal grief. It was a look that had no place on the face of a stranger. Have we met before? Henry asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger tipped his hat. Don't believe so, sir. Just passing through. Garrett and his men rode off in a cloud of dust and fury, leaving Henry alone with his savior. I don't even know your name, Henry said. The stranger dismounted. Up close, Henry could see he was younger than he'd thought, maybe in his early 30s. His face was lean and weathered, but it was those blue eyes that held Henry captive. They were the eyes of his son. Name's Cole, the man said. Cole Davidson. As for repayment, I was hoping you might have room for one more at your dinner table. It's been a long time since I've had a home-cooked meal. Henry's heart swelled. Mr. Davidson, you can stay as long as you like. As they walked toward the house, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. The eyes, the glance at Martha's grave, the exact amount of money, it was too much. Who was Cole Davidson? And why did it feel like he was welcoming a ghost back into his home? A ghost he had driven away himself 15 years ago. Later that evening, after a quiet meal of beans and cornbread, Henry offered the stranger the spare room, his son's old room. Cole, or whatever his name was, hesitated, then nodded. Henry watched him walk down the short hallway and stop at the door. He saw the man's hand rest on the wooden frame, his knuckles turning white. He saw him stare into the room, at the narrow bed with its faded quilt, at the small desk by the window. He was staring at it not as a stranger, but as someone remembering. Henry's heart was a drum against his ribs. He knew. He had known since he saw those eyes, but he needed to hear it. He picked up the oil lamp from the hall table, its light casting long, dancing shadows. He walked slowly toward the man standing in the doorway of the past. It's just as she left it, Henry said, his voice thick. She dusted it every week, mended his old shirts, Said he'd come home when he was ready. The stranger didn't turn. His shoulders were rigid. She never lost faith, Henry continued, the words tearing at his throat. Even after 15 years, she always believed her boy would come home. Finally, the man turned. In the flickering lamplight, the hard lines on his face seemed to soften. The years of dust and sun and violence seemed to melt away, and for a heartbreaking second, Henry saw the 17-year-old boy who had stormed out into the night. And those blue eyes. They were filled with a universe of pain. Nathan? Henry whispered, the name a prayer and a curse on his lips. Dear God in heaven, is it really you? The man, his son, closed his eyes. Hello, Pa. The lamp slipped from Henry's fingers. It crashed to the floor, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. But the darkness was nothing compared to the void that had lived in Henry's heart for 15 years. A void that was now filled with a terrifying, beautiful, impossible light. His son was home. His son, who he thought was dead or lost forever, was standing just a few feet away. But the man who had returned was not the boy who had left. This man was a gunslinger, a stranger named Cole Davidson, who carried a fortune in his saddlebags and death in his eyes. And Henry had to wonder, what kind of hell had his son walked through to come back here? And what kind of hell had he brought back with him? Henry's hands shook as he fumbled for matches, finally relighting a lamp. The warm glow fell on Nathan's face, a face so familiar and yet so terrifyingly different. The innocence was gone, replaced by scars both seen and unseen. Cole Davidson, Henry finally managed to ask. Nathan nodded. My middle name, Ma's maiden name, seemed fitting. After I swore I'd never be a Whitmore again. The words were a punch to the gut. Why now, Nathan? After all this time? I never stopped keeping tabs, Nathan admitted, his voice low. Had friends send letters. I heard about the drought, about the bank. I heard... He swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the window that faced the hill. I heard about Ma's passing. I was in Denver. Rode for 6 weeks straight. 6 weeks too late, Henry said, the bitterness he'd held for years spilling out. She died calling your name. The truth of it landed like a physical blow. Nathan sagged against the wall, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. I tried to come back, 12 times. I'd ride to the ridge overlooking the valley, and I'd turn around. I told myself you were both better off, that all I'd ever bring you was trouble. And here's where the story takes its first dark turn. The money, Nathan, Henry said, his voice sharp. $8,000. That's not cowboy wages. That's a king's ransom. Where did you get it? Nathan looked up, and the look in his eyes sent a chill down Henry's spine. It was the look of a man who had made a deal with the devil. I worked, he said vaguely. Cattle drives, breaking horses, hunting bounties. Bounties? Henry scoffed. No bounty pays that much. Not unless the man you're hunting is the governor himself. Tell me the truth. Nathan hesitated, a war playing out across his features. Finally, he let out a ragged breath. It wasn't a bounty, it was a job. A bank job. In Colorado. Henry felt the floor drop out from under him. You robbed a bank? No, Nathan said quickly. Not like that. I was hired security. A new bank moving a fortune in gold bullion. We were supposed to guard the transport wagon, but we were ambushed. His eyes went distant, seeing a past Henry couldn't imagine. It was a bloodbath. Everyone was killed. Everyone but me. I grabbed one of the pouches of gold and I ran. I just ran. So the money wasn't just a gift, it was a secret. A heavy, bloody secret. The gold that had saved their home was stolen. Or at least it belonged to a bank that thought it was stolen. So you're a wanted man? Henry asked, his mind reeling. They don't know who I am, Nathan said. I was using a different name then, too. They think the lone survivor was just another dead guard. But there are other people, the ones who planned the ambush. They know one pouch is missing, and they know it was a man with blue eyes who got away with it. Before Henry could even process this bombshell, a sound from outside shattered the night. The thunder of hoofbeats. Not one or two riders. A small army. Nathan was on his feet in an instant, his gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Henry joined him, his blood running cold. At least 8 riders, all wearing masks. And at their head, even in the moonlight, he recognized the hulking shape of Dutch, Garrett's enforcer. "It's Garrett's men," Henry said grimly. "He wasn't content just losing. He wants to burn us out." Nathan's face was grim. He looked at the armed men surrounding their home, then back at his father. "He's not here to burn us out, Pa. He's here for the gold." Henry stared at him, confused. How could he possibly know? "Because Garrett didn't just show up a day early by coincidence," Nathan said, his voice dangerously low. "He was tipped off. Someone knew I was coming. Someone knew I had the money." Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Vincent Garrett wasn't just a greedy banker trying to foreclose on a ranch. He was connected to something much bigger, something much more dangerous. The ambush in Colorado, it wasn't random. "Garrett," Nathan whispered, his eyes wide with a terrible realization. "He was one of them. He was one of the men who planned the robbery." The money hadn't saved them. It had just painted a giant target on their backs. And now the wolves were at the door. They weren't just trapped. They were standing on a powder keg, and Dutch was holding the match. "Whitmore!" Dutch's voice boomed from the darkness. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got a guest. Send out the stranger and his gold, and we'll let you live." So it was true. This wasn't about the ranch anymore. It was a hunt. "You still keep that old Winchester over the fireplace?" Nathan asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the chaos that must have been churning inside him. "Loaded and ready," Henry confirmed, moving toward the hearth. The feel of the familiar weapon in his hands was a small comfort. "These aren't just thugs, son," Henry warned. "Dutch rode with the Clanton gang. He's a killer." "Then tonight he meets his maker," Nathan said, his voice flat and hard. He moved through the house with a terrifying efficiency, extinguishing the lamps, turning their home into a shadowy fortress. He took up a position at the front window, his own modified rifle now in his hands. "Last chance, old man," Dutch yelled. "Talk with guns drawn and faces covered." Nathan called back, his voice ringing out with surprising power. "That's not how honest men do business." There was a surprised silence from outside. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected a scared old man and a drifter. They hadn't expected a fight. "You should have kept riding, stranger," Dutch shouted. "This ain't your fight." "Became my fight the moment you threatened this man's home," Nathan replied coolly. "And the name's Davidson. Cole Davidson. You might want to remember it, assuming you live long enough to tell anyone." A ripple of unease went through the masked riders. Henry could hear them muttering. The name Cole Davidson meant something to them. His son's reputation, whatever it was, had preceded him. "Davidson?" Dutch's voice was less certain now. "The same Davidson who cleaned out the Jameson gang up in Colorado?" "The very same," Nathan confirmed. Wait, the Jameson gang, Henry thought. Nathan had said he was hired security. He never mentioned a gang. Was that another lie? What other secrets was his son hiding? There was no time to ask. "I'm giving you boys 1 minute to ride away," Nathan called out. "After that, I start thinning the herd." The first shot wasn't from Nathan. It came from the corral, a rifle bullet shattering the window frame inches from his head. And then the night exploded. Nathan's return fire was a single, precise crack. A man tumbled from his saddle with a choked cry. Henry's Winchester boomed from the kitchen, and another attacker dove for cover. The house was peppered with gunfire. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Bullets whizzed through the rooms like angry bees. But the old adobe walls were thick, and Henry and Nathan were well protected. Nathan was a machine. He worked the lever of his rifle with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. Each shot was aimed. Each shot found a target. Another man went down trying to rush the porch. A third, trying to circle around back, cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. The relentless, accurate fire was too much for them. The attack faltered. The surviving men pulled back, retreating to the cover of the barn. "Davidson!" Dutch yelled, his voice strained. "You're good. I'll give you that. But we can wait you out. Come morning, we'll burn you out like rats. We've got food, water, and plenty of ammunition, Nathan bluffed. How long before the sheriff starts wondering where you boys got to? As the gunmen conferred behind the barn, Henry turned to Nathan in the darkness. Son, what was that about the Jameson gang? Nathan was silent for a moment. It's complicated, Pa. Uncomplicated, Henry demanded. Nathan sighed. I wasn't just hired security for that gold transport. I was part of the crew, the Jameson gang. I was their inside man. But I got tired of the life. I was going to take my cut and disappear. But then they told me the plan for the final score. Ambush the wagon, kill all the guards. I couldn't do it. I tried to warn the guards, but it was too late. The ambush started, and in the chaos, I grabbed a bag and ran. I left that life behind. So his son hadn't just been a guard. He'd been an outlaw, a member of a notorious gang, and he'd run out on them. The men outside weren't just Garrett's hired thugs. They were likely connected to the same gang. They weren't just here for the gold. They were here for the traitor who had stolen it. But here's where the story twists again, into something darker and deeper than a simple tale of robbery and revenge. There's something else, Henry said, his mind racing, connecting dots he'd never seen before. Garrett, he's been trying to buy up all the land in this valley, not just mine, the Morrison place, the Rodriguez spread. He said the railroad was coming, but what if that was a lie? A lie for what? Nathan asked, peering through the shattered window. Your mother, Henry said, the words catching in his throat. She wasn't from here, you know. She came from back east. Her family was, well, they were complicated people. Before she died, when the sickness had her mind, she kept talking about something she'd hidden, something she said would set things right. She said she buried it on the ranch. Under the watchful eye, she'd say. Nathan stared at him. What did she hide? I never knew, Henry confessed. I thought it was just the fever talking. But Garrett, he wasn't just trying to foreclose. He was asking questions around town, not about the quality of the land, but about its history, about who owned it before me, about your mother's family. Suddenly, it wasn't about the stolen gold anymore. The gold was just what had led Nathan, in trouble, back to this ranch. But the real prize, the thing Garrett was truly after, was something else entirely. Something Martha Whitmore had buried years ago. And as this realization dawned on them, a new sound cut through the night. More hoofbeats, a lot of them, approaching fast from the direction of town. Reinforcements. But for which side? Dutch! A new voice called out, firm and authoritative. This is Sheriff Patterson. Drop your weapons. You're under arrest. The sheriff. For a moment, relief washed over Henry. But then Dutch's response was not surrender. It was a defiant curse and another rifle shot, this one aimed at the new arrivals. The night erupted into a full-scale battle. Caught between the house and the sheriff's posse, Dutch's men were pinned down. The fight was short and brutal. When the silence returned, Sheriff Patterson and his deputies were rounding up the survivors. Dutch was on the ground, bleeding from a shoulder wound, but alive. The sheriff, a tall, steady-eyed man, approached the porch. Mr. Whitmore, glad we got here in time. My deputy saw this trash riding out of town armed to the teeth. He looked at Nathan, his eyes lingering. And you must be Cole Davidson. Heard stories about you. Just helping out a friend, Nathan said. Well, your friend Dutch here has been singing like a canary, the sheriff said, nodding toward the wounded outlaw. He confirmed it. Garrett hired them, but not just to get back the money you took from him. He says Garrett's been obsessed with this property for years. Says there's a map. Henry and Nathan exchanged a look. A map? Henry asked. The sheriff nodded. According to Dutch, your wife, Martha, was the daughter of a very wealthy and very corrupt railroad tycoon from back east. Before he died, he gave her a map showing where he'd hidden his entire illicit fortune. Millions of dollars in gold and bonds. He hid it somewhere out here in the territories to keep it from the government. Garrett somehow found out the map was on this ranch. He's been trying to get his hands on it for years. The foreclosure, the attack, it was all to get the map. The world tilted on its axis. His quiet, gentle Martha, the woman who loved her garden and her family, was the keeper of a secret pirate treasure. The legacy she'd left behind wasn't just love and memories. It was a fortune big enough to get them all killed. Under the watchful eye, Henry whispered. Nathan looked at him. What did you say, Pa? It's what she used to say, Henry explained, his heart pounding. The rock formation on the north pasture, the one that looks like a man's face watching over the valley. The locals call it the Watcher. The map wasn't a piece of paper. The location was a riddle, and Henry had just solved it. But just as a glimmer of hope appeared, Sheriff Patterson's face grew grim. There's another problem, he said, his voice low. Dutch said Garrett isn't working alone. His partner, the one who bankrolled this whole operation, is the leader of the Jameson gang, a man they call the Preacher. And according to Dutch, he and the rest of his gang are on their way here right now. They think you, he said, looking at Nathan, double-crossed them and are trying to find the treasure for yourself. The stolen bank gold was a drop in the ocean. The real storm was just about to break. They had found the key to a hidden fortune, but in doing so, they had just put themselves in the crosshairs of one of the most ruthless gangs in the West. And they were coming. They were coming for the map, the gold, and for Nathan's blood. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gray and blood orange, but it brought no comfort. It only served to illuminate the grim reality of their situation. The yard was littered with the evidence of the night's battle. The sheriff and his 3 deputies were a welcome sight, but they were vastly outnumbered by the force that was supposedly on its way. The Preacher, Nathan said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He's not a man you can reason with. He thinks he's on a mission from God, a mission that involves taking whatever he wants and killing anyone who stands in his way. How long do we have? Sheriff Patterson asked. Nathan scanned the horizon. If Dutch told them where we are, they could be here by noon, maybe sooner. There are a dozen of them, all seasoned killers. Panic began to set in, a cold dread that Henry hadn't felt even when facing Garrett. This was different. This was an army of demons riding down on them. We have to get the map, Henry said, his voice urgent. If we can get to the treasure first, maybe we can use it to bargain. There's no bargaining with the Preacher, Nathan cut him off. He'll take the gold and kill us anyway, just to make a point. Our only chance is to fortify this house and make a stand. But then another twist, a twist that came not from a gunman's rifle, but from a piece of paper. One of the deputies, a young man named Evans, was searching the pockets of the men who had fallen during the night. Sheriff, he called out, you need to see this. He held up a folded telegram, pulled from the pocket of one of Garrett's men. It was dated 2 days ago. Sheriff Patterson read it aloud, his voice grim. Garrett, location confirmed. The asset is on the Whitmore Ranch, but the railroad survey is complete. The new route bypasses the valley entirely. Your land deal is worthless. My patience is at an end. Secure the asset by any means necessary. The Preacher. Henry stared at them, his mind struggling to comprehend. The railroad? It's not coming? It was all a lie, the sheriff said, crumpling the telegram in his fist. A cover story to justify Garrett buying up all the land so he could search for the treasure without anyone getting suspicious. But there was something else in that message, something far more chilling. The asset is on the Whitmore Ranch. It didn't say the map is on the ranch. It said the asset. And that's when another memory surfaced in Henry's mind, sharp and clear, a memory of Martha in her final days holding his hand. She'd been delirious, her words disjointed. It's not in the ground, Henry, she had whispered, her eyes wide and fearful. It's in the blood. Protect the blood. Henry had thought it was nonsense, the ramblings of a dying woman. But now... Oh, dear God, Henry breathed, staggering back against the porch rail. Nathan grabbed his arm. Pa, what is it? It's not a map, Henry said, the horrific realization dawning on him. It was never a map. The treasure isn't buried out there. Martha, she was the treasure. Everyone stared at him in confusion. Her father wasn't just a corrupt tycoon, Henry explained, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. He was a master forger. Before he died, he converted his entire fortune into bearer bonds. Untraceable. Worth millions. but he needed a way to pass them on to her without a paper trail. So he created a new identity for her. Martha Whitmore. He erased her old life completely. The fortune is tied to her name, her bloodline. To claim it, you need proof of her identity, her birth certificate, legal papers, documents proving who she really was. So the asset, the sheriff whispered, is the proof, Henry finished. A lockbox containing all her original documents. That's what Garrett and the preacher are after. That's what she hid. The treasure wasn't gold buried under a rock. It was a small box of papers. Papers that could make someone the richest man in the territory. Papers that his wife had died to protect. "Where is it, Pa?" Nathan asked, his voice tight. "Where did she hide the box?" Henry's eyes darted around the ranch, his mind racing through his wife's habits, her secret places. The loose floorboard in the pantry, the hollowed-out book in the study. No, it had to be somewhere safer. Somewhere no one would ever think to look. Somewhere she went every single day. Her garden. "The sundial," Henry whispered. "The stone sundial she had me build for her in the middle of her vegetable garden. The base is hollow." Just as he said it, Deputy Evans, who was keeping watch, yelled from the edge of the porch, "Riders, on the ridge! At least a dozen of them!" They were out of time. The preacher had arrived. "Barricade the doors and windows," the sheriff ordered. "We make our stand here." But Nathan had a different look in his eye, a wild, desperate look. "No," he said. "They'll tear this house apart to find that box. They'll burn it to the ground with us inside it. We can't win a siege." "So what do we do, run?" the deputy asked, his face pale. "We give them a choice," Nathan said, his eyes locking with his father's. "We split up. Pa, you and the sheriff get the box. Take the horses and ride for the canyon. There are caves and trails back there they'll never find. Draw them away from here." "And you?" Henry asked, his heart seizing with fear. A grim smile touched Nathan's lips. "The preacher isn't just here for the box. He's here for me. I'm the loose end, the traitor. I'll stay here. I'll give him the fight he came for. I'll be the diversion." It was a suicide mission, a one-man stand against a dozen killers. "No, Nathan, I won't leave you," Henry cried. "You have to," Nathan said, his voice hard but his eyes pleading. "You have to protect what Ma left for us. It was her legacy, her final wish. Don't let it be for nothing. You protect the past, I'll protect the future. Now go." Sheriff Patterson grabbed Henry's arm. "He's right, Henry. It's our only chance." Tears streamed down Henry's face as he looked at the son he had just found, the son he was about to lose all over again. He saw the boy he had raised and the hardened man he had become. And for the first time, he saw they were one and the same, stubborn, brave, and willing to sacrifice everything for family. Henry and the sheriff sprinted for the garden, prying the heavy stone sundial from its base. Beneath it was a small, oilcloth-wrapped metal box. They grabbed it and ran for the barn as the first shots from the ridge kicked up dust around their feet. As Henry mounted his horse, he looked back at the ranch house. Nathan stood on the porch, alone. He held his rifle in one hand and his Colt in the other, a solitary figure against the coming storm. He looked back at his father and gave a single, sharp nod, a promise, a farewell. Then Henry and the sheriff spurred their horses, riding hard for the canyons. The precious box clutched in Henry's hands. Behind them, the full fury of the Jameson gang descended on the lone ranch house. On his son, Henry rode on, the sound of the raging gun battle echoing behind him, praying for a miracle he knew wouldn't come. The canyons were a maze of twisted rock and shadow. Henry and Sheriff Patterson rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit, the sounds of the gunfight at the ranch slowly fading behind them. Every instinct screamed at Henry to turn back, to fight and die alongside his son. But the weight of the metal box in his saddlebag was a constant reminder of his promise. "Protect the past. I'll protect the future." "We need to find a place to hole up," the sheriff yelled over the pounding of hooves. "Someplace defensible." Henry nodded, his mind racing. He knew these canyons better than anyone. As a boy, he'd explored every nook and cranny. "There's a place," he shouted back. "An old miner's cabin, tucked into a box canyon. Only one way in or out. If they follow us, they'll have to come straight at us. They found the cabin an hour later, a dilapidated shack leaning against a sheer rock wall. It wasn't much, but it was cover. They dismounted, leading their exhausted horses into the narrow canyon, and took up positions among the rocks at the entrance, rifles ready, and they waited. The silence was agonizing. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching riders. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Henry's mind was a whirlwind of grief and fear. He pictured Nathan, alone, facing down a dozen killers. He imagined the house he'd built with his own hands being riddled with bullets, consumed by fire. He had gotten his son back only to send him to his death. "It's my fault," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "All of it. My pride. I drove him away. If I hadn't, he never would have fallen in with that gang. He'd be safe." "You can't know that, Henry," the sheriff said, his eyes scanning the landscape. "A man makes his own choices, good or bad. What matters is the choice he makes in the end. And your son, he chose to stand and fight for his home, for you." Hours passed like a slow-motion nightmare. The sun climbed high, beating down on the rocks. Their water was running low. Their hope was running lower. And then they heard it. Hoofbeats. Not the frantic pace of a pursuit. Slow, deliberate. A single rider. Henry and the sheriff raised their rifles, their knuckles white. A figure appeared at the mouth of the canyon, riding a familiar chestnut mare. The rider was slumped in the saddle, but he was upright. It was Nathan. He was alive. Henry scrambled from behind the rocks, tears of disbelief and joy streaming down his face. "Nathan!" His son slid from the saddle, stumbling as his feet hit the ground. His coat was torn and soaked in blood. A crude bandage was wrapped around his left arm, and blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. But he was alive, and he was grinning, a weary, painful grin. "Told you I'd handle it, Pa," he rasped. "How?" the sheriff asked, his face a mask of astonishment. "How did you survive?" And here, the story takes its most unbelievable turn. "I didn't fight them in the house," Nathan said, leaning against his horse for support. "That was a fool's game. I let them get close. I let them think they had me trapped." He took a long swallow from the sheriff's canteen. "Then I did what they'd least expect. I ran, not away from them, towards them." He explained how he'd slipped out the back of the house as they surrounded the front, using the barn and the outbuildings for cover. He'd circled around behind them. "They were all focused on the house," Nathan continued, his voice gaining strength. "Ready to burn it down. They never thought to watch their backs. I took out their guard first, silently. Then I found their dynamite." The sheriff's eyes widened. "Dynamite?" "They brought it to blow the house open," Nathan said with a grim satisfaction. "I just repurposed it, planted it right in the middle of their horses. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late." The explosion had been catastrophic. It had scattered their forces, killed several of their horses, and thrown them into chaos. In the ensuing confusion, under the cover of smoke and dust, Nathan had waged a one-man guerrilla war. He picked them off one by one from the rocks and gullies around the ranch, a ghost they could never pin down. "They're not all dead," Nathan admitted. "The preacher and a few of his men got away. But they're scattered, wounded, and on foot. They won't be a threat to us for a while." He had done it. He had faced an army and won. Relief washed over Henry, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. But his relief was short-lived, because as Nathan stumbled forward into the shade of the canyon wall, something fell from inside his torn coat. It wasn't a gun or a knife. It was a book, a small leather-bound journal. Henry recognized it instantly. It was Martha's, her personal diary. He thought it had been lost in the fire that took their first home, years ago. "Where did you get that?" Henry asked, his voice trembling. Nathan looked down at the journal as if seeing it for the first time. I don't know. It must have been in my saddlebag. I grabbed a few things before I left Denver in a hurry. But that didn't make sense. Why would Nathan have his mother's journal?" Henry picked it up. The leather was worn, the pages brittle. He opened it to a random page. Martha's familiar handwriting filled the page. But the words made no sense. It was a story about her childhood, but the details were wrong. She wrote about growing up on a small farm in Ohio, about her poor but loving parents. But Henry knew Martha had grown up in a mansion in Philadelphia. She was the daughter of a tycoon. This was a complete fabrication, a lie. He flipped through the pages. The entire journal was filled with the same story, a detailed, consistent, but completely false life history. "What is this, Nathan?" Henry demanded. And that's when Sheriff Patterson, who had been quietly tending to Nathan's wounds, suddenly went rigid. He was staring at the journal in Henry's hands, but his focus was on a small symbol embossed on the leather cover. A symbol Henry hadn't even noticed. A stylized bird with a key in its beak. "I've seen that symbol before," the sheriff said, his voice deadly serious. "On a wanted poster, a very old one, for a woman known only as the Mockingbird." He looked from the journal to Henry, then to Nathan, his face pale with a dawning, impossible realization. "The Mockingbird," the sheriff whispered, "was the most famous forger and documentarian in the entire country. She worked for the criminal underworld, creating new identities, false histories, unbreakable alibis. They said she could turn a pauper into a prince with nothing but a pen and ink. She disappeared 25 years ago. No one ever knew her real name." The silence in the canyon was absolute. The puzzle pieces were all there, but they formed a picture so monstrous, so unbelievable, that Henry's mind refused to accept it. Martha, his sweet, gentle Martha, the woman who tended her garden, the woman who hummed lullabies to their son. She wasn't the daughter of a tycoon hiding from her past. She was the past. She was the Mockingbird. The story about her father's hidden fortune was a lie, a brilliant, intricate lie she had crafted herself, recorded in this very journal, a final masterpiece of misdirection. There was no inheritance. There were no bearer bonds. The lockbox didn't contain proof of her identity. It contained her tools, blank birth certificates from a dozen states, official-looking seals, vials of specialty ink, everything she would need to create a new life from scratch. It wasn't a treasure chest. It was a getaway kit. "But why?" Henry stammered. "Why would she do all this? Why the lie about the treasure?" Nathan, leaning against the rock, finally spoke, his voice heavy with a truth he was only just beginning to understand himself. "Because she knew my life with the Jameson gang would eventually lead them here. She knew they'd come looking for something valuable. So she created a story, a myth, a treasure hunt to lead them on a wild goose chase, to make them tear the ranch apart looking for something that didn't exist. It was all a diversion, a final forgery to protect her family." His mother hadn't been a victim hiding a fortune. She had been a master strategist laying a trap from beyond the grave. And the final, most devastating secret was yet to be revealed. Nathan looked at his father, his blue eyes filled with a new, terrible understanding. "The gold, Pa. The $8,000 I used to save the ranch. I told you I stole it from the gang after the ambush." "Yes?" Henry said, dreading what was coming next. "That was a lie, too," Nathan confessed, his voice breaking. "There was no ambush. There was no bloodbath. I wasn't a guard, and I wasn't a traitor who ran. The bank job in Colorado, I planned it. The Jameson gang, they worked for me. I was their leader." The final lie fell away, exposing the raw, ugly truth. His son Nathan wasn't just an outlaw. He wasn't just a member of the gang. He was the preacher. He had led his own gang to his family's doorstep, chasing a treasure his own mother had invented, all to get his hands on the one thing that could give him a clean start. Her lockbox, her tools, the means to disappear forever. The fight at the ranch, his suicide mission, it was all a show, a performance to get Henry and the sheriff away from him so he could deal with his own mutinous crew and claim his prize. Henry stared at the man before him, the stranger, the son, the savior, the outlaw, the preacher. They were all the same person. A web of lies so tangled, he didn't know if he could ever find his son again inside it. The prodigal son had returned, but he hadn't come home for forgiveness. He'd come home to finish one last job, and the whole world had just crumbled at Henry Whitmore's feet. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sheriff Patterson instinctively took a step back, his hand moving toward his gun. He was standing in a canyon with one of the most wanted men in the territories. Henry felt nothing, just a vast, cold emptiness. He looked at the man who was his son, the outlaw known as the preacher, and he saw the final, tragic truth. The rage-filled 17-year-old boy who had stormed out 15 years ago hadn't disappeared. He had festered. He had grown into this. So it was all a lie, Henry said, his voice hollow. Saving the ranch? The story about the ambush? Fighting for your home? Saving the ranch was real, Nathan, or whatever he called himself now, said, his voice raw. That part was true. When I heard about the foreclosure, about what you were going through, I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let Garrett take Ma's home. So you brought your army of killers here instead? The sheriff spat. They weren't supposed to come here, Nathan shot back, wincing as the movement agitated his wounds. Garrett was my connection in Tombstone. He was supposed to handle the foreclosure quietly. I sent him the gold to pay off the debt, to get the deed. But he got greedy. He must have heard the local legends about Martha's family, the rumors of a hidden fortune. He decided to take it all for himself. He sent Dutch and his men to take the ranch, and he sent a message to my crew, telling them I was double-crossing them. He set this whole thing in motion. The story was so convoluted, so layered with deceit, it was almost impossible to believe. But the evidence was right in front of them. The journal, the lockbox, the wounded outlaw who was also the prodigal son. So the men you fought back at the ranch, Henry began. Were my own crew, Nathan finished grimly. They thought I'd betrayed them, thanks to Garrett. I had no choice. It was them or me. He had fought his own men, not as a hero defending his home, but as a king defending his throne from a coup. The story was even darker than Henry could have imagined. But in the midst of this darkness, a flicker of something else emerged. A desperate, flawed, but undeniable love. I came back for the box, yes, Nathan admitted, his gaze fixed on his father. I needed a way out, a new life. The preacher was becoming a ghost I couldn't outrun. But I also came back for you. When I stood on that porch and saw Garrett threatening you, something broke inside me. I wasn't the preacher anymore. I was just Nathan Whitmore, watching a snake try to steal his father's home. Everything I did after that, paying the debt, fighting my own men, it was for you, for Ma's memory. It was the only truth in a sea of lies. Henry looked into his son's eyes, and the same blue eyes he'd looked into the day the boy was born, and he saw the terrible, agonizing conflict raging within him. The man was a killer, a liar, and a thief. But he was also his son, and he had come home. What happens now? Sheriff Patterson asked, his voice low but firm. His hand still rested on the butt of his gun. He was a man of the law, and the law was clear. Nathan looked at the sheriff, then at his father. He slowly, painfully, unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop to the dusty ground. It was an act of surrender. What happens now, Nathan said, is that the preacher dies today, in this canyon, and Nathan Whitmore has to answer for his crimes. He was giving himself up. After all the lies, all the violence, all the running, he was finally choosing to stop. But destiny, it seems, had one final, bloody chapter to write. A rifle shot echoed through the canyon. Sheriff Patterson cried out and staggered back, a red stain blossoming on his chest. He crumpled to the ground. Henry spun around, his own rifle coming up just as figures appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was the last of the Jameson gang. 4 of them, wounded, bloody, but very much alive. And with them, his face contorted in a mask of triumphant fury, was Vincent Garrett. It seems your little story had a few holes in it, preacher, Garrett sneered, holding a smoking rifle. You didn't finish the job. We followed the tracks. Now, the box and the journal. Hand them over. The preacher was dead, but the gunslinger was not. In a flash, Nathan dove for his fallen gun belt, scooping up his Colt. He came up firing. The canyon exploded into a final, desperate battle. Henry fired his Winchester, taking cover behind the rocks, the years falling away as he fought side by side with his son. Garrett's men were tired and wounded, and they were no match for Nathan's focused fury. He was a whirlwind of motion and death, his every shot precise, his movements economical. He was fighting for more than just his life now. He was fighting for his father, for his soul. One by one, the remaining gang members fell, until it was just Garrett left, fumbling to reload his rifle. Nathan stood before him, his Colt steady, his face a grim mask. "It's over, Garrett," Nathan said. Garrett laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "It was never about the money for me, boy. Your mother. She ruined my family. My father was her partner, before she disappeared and faked her death. She took everything. I wasn't after a treasure. I was after revenge." He lunged, not with his rifle, but with a knife that appeared from his boot. He was faster than Henry expected. He slammed into Nathan, and they both went down in a desperate scuffle. The gun flew from Nathan's hand. Henry aimed his Winchester, but he couldn't get a clear shot. The two men were a tangle of limbs rolling in the dust. He saw the glint of Garrett's knife rise and fall. He heard his son cry out in pain. And then a single muffled gunshot. The two figures separated. Garrett lay still on the ground. Nathan pushed himself up, clutching his side. In his other hand, he held a tiny Derringer, the kind of gun a gambler might hide up his sleeve. Henry rushed to his side. "Nathan! It was Ma's!" Nathan gasped, blood bubbling on his lips. He had pulled it from his own boot. "She gave it to me the night I left. Said, every man needs a final secret." He had been stabbed, a deep, mortal wound to his side. He was dying. Henry knelt, cradling his son's head in his lap. The lockbox, the journal, the dead men. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the life fading from his son's eyes. "I'm sorry, Pa," Nathan whispered, his breath shallow. "For everything." "Hush now, son," Henry said, tears blurring his vision. "You're home. You came home." Nathan looked up at him, and for a moment, the hardened killer was gone. It was just a boy, lost and afraid, who had finally found his way back. "Pa," he whispered. That place at the dinner table, did she really, every night?" "Every night, son," Henry choked out. "She never gave up on you." A faint smile touched Nathan's lips. His eyes fluttered and closed, and he was gone. Henry Whitmore sat there in the canyon, holding his son, surrounded by the wreckage of their past. The prodigal son had returned. He had saved the ranch. He had faced his demons. He had found his truth, and he had paid the ultimate price. When the dust settled, Henry and the wounded but alive Sheriff Patterson were the only ones left. They buried Nathan on the hill, next to his mother, under the watchful eye of the silent stone face. There was no funeral, no eulogy, just a father's silent grief. Henry took the lockbox, his wife's final secret, and the stolen gold his son had bled for, and he dropped them both into the deepest, darkest mineshaft in the county. Martha's dangerous past and Nathan's bloody fortune were buried forever. He kept only the journal, a reminder of the brilliant, complicated woman he had loved, and the son who had been both a sinner and a saint. The ranch survived. The rains eventually came, washing the blood from the dust and bringing new life to the valley. Henry Whitmore lived out his days on the land he had fought for, a quiet, solitary man. But every evening, as the sun went down, he would go into his kitchen and set two places at the dinner table, one for the wife he missed, and one for the prodigal son who had, in the end, finally come home. His story became a whisper in the wind, a legend in the valley, a story of how a family's secrets can be more dangerous than any outlaw's gun, and how redemption can sometimes be found in the very last place you'd ever think to look. If you were moved by Henry and Nathan's story, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more tales of the Wild West, of lost souls and hard-won justice coming your way. And drop a comment below. What part of this story will stick with you the most? Thanks for watching.